Sign it. Sign the divorce papers.
I am.
Sign those papers!
The divorce papers touched the glass table before Ilara fully understood what Ronan had done. For one sharp second, the ballroom kept smiling around them. Crystal lights spilled over champagne towers. The quartet kept playing something expensive and forgettable. Behind the stage, the main screen still glowed with the words, "Congratulations, Ronan Voss, Executive Vice President." Investors were still nodding to one another. Senior managers were still clapping on reflex. A waiter passed with silver trays as if nothing at all had cracked open in the center of the room. Then Ilara looked down. Her name was already printed there. The petition had been prepared in advance, signatures marked for witness, legal tabs fixed neatly to the corner. Someone had planned not just the divorce, but the timing, the optics, the audience. Her throat tightened, but she did not move. At Ronan's side, she stood perfectly still in a dark dress, simple enough for Celeste Voss to have insulted twice already that evening. Too plain, too severe, too small for a celebration like this. Each comment had been delivered with a smile. Each smile had been seen. Ilara had let it pass because part of her still believed the night was only about his promotion. Part of her still believed he would not cross the final line in public. She had been wrong. Ronan did not lower his voice. He did not step closer to spare her humiliation. He did not even look ashamed. His expression was controlled, almost administrative. "Let's do this cleanly," he said. Cleanly. The word cut deeper than anger would have. A hush spread across the nearest tables, not because these people were morally shocked, but because wealthy people could sense spectacle before they admitted they were watching it. Several guests turned away just enough to claim decency while listening to every word. Celeste lifted her glass first. "You should be grateful, dear," she said, with the soft cruelty of a woman who liked her insults polished. "Most women in your position leave with far less." A few people laughed under their breath. Gideon Voss adjusted one cufflink and spoke as if he were concluding a board item, not humiliating his daughter-in-law in public. "There is dignity in knowing when you've outlived your usefulness." On Ilara's left, Tamsin Voss, Ronan's younger sister, who wore refinement like a blade, said coolly, "At least this settles the domestic distraction before the next announcement." Maris, and the family cousin who lived on inherited access and company-funded appearances, leaned toward a nearby couple and added, "Once she signs, the real celebration can finally begin." Tamsin let out a thin, humorless laugh at last, and the family's approval spread so openly around Ronan that to Ilara it felt as if every one of them were laughing. Then Gideon raised his voice just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Her signature is the last housekeeping item before the company's next chapter." And all at once, Ilara understood the design of it. This was not a private betrayal. This was a ritual. They were not simply ending a marriage. They were clearing Ronan's image in front of investors, lenders, executives, and social allies before presenting him as the face of a new era. They wanted witnesses. And they wanted her silence to look voluntary. They wanted her removal to feel tidy, mature, and inevitable. Her fingers trembled once at her side. Ronan noticed and mistook it for weakness. "My promotion changes everything," he said, voice low but perfectly audible. "I need a partner who fits the future. This is necessary." Necessary. That word almost made her laugh, because once, in a quieter life that now felt impossible, he had known what dignity meant. Once he had held her hand in a room full of damaged canvases and promised he would never let her stand alone in a room that wished her harm. Once he had looked at her as though silence was something sacred, not useful. Now he could not even give her privacy. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Celeste saw the tears and relaxed. Gideon did too. Maris looked openly pleased, and they all made the same mistake at the same time. They thought the tears meant collapse. But Ilara was not crying because she feared poverty. She was not crying because she thought she had lost status. She was not even crying because the marriage was ending on paper. She was crying because the last decent part of the man she had loved had just died in front of her. Near the back of the room, Alden Rook, the old CFO, silver-haired, observant, and never wasteful with reaction, watched her with a different expression. He noticed what most of the room did not. There was no panic in her face, no pleading, no scramble, only grief. Deep, still, terrible grief, as if she were not being discarded, as if she were witnessing a burial. A few feet away, Soren Valek stood between two clusters of family loyalists, or caught in the old position he always occupied, close enough to the Voss circle to witness its cruelty, never central enough to stop it. Gideon's late brother had married Soren's mother years earlier, and although the family had folded him into the company orbit, they never let him forget he did not carry the bloodline. He did not laugh. He did not intervene either. His jaw tightened, and Ilara saw the shame flicker across his face before he lowered his eyes. The quartet kept playing. That made the whole thing uglier. Someone near the stage whispered, "Is this really happening?" Another whispered back, "They're doing it before the board transition remarks." Board transition. So there was more. Of course there was. Ilara lowered her gaze to the papers again. The pen lay beside them like a final instruction. Ronan waited. His family waited. The room waited. They wanted her quiet. They wanted her erased. They wanted it finished before the final announcement sealed his triumph. Instead, she lifted her chin. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to make people lean closer. "Are you certain," she asked, "that you want me to sign this before the evening is over?" For a beat, nobody moved. Then Celeste laughed. Gideon followed. Maris covered her mouth with delighted disbelief. Around them, the sound spread from table to table, the way cruelty always grew braver in company. Ronan's face hardened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ilara looked at him for one long, unbearable second. Then she picked up the pen. And though tears slipped soundlessly down her face, there was something in her eyes the room had not yet learned how to fear. Not anger, not desperation, or a final mercy, one they were about to lose. He had once promised she would never stand alone. That was what made the papers feel heavier than paper. As the ballroom's laughter pressed against her ears, Ilara's mind cut backward with brutal clarity. Not to another argument, not to another insult, but to the first place Ronan had ever looked at her, as if the world grew quieter around her. The Lark House. Years earlier, before the boardrooms and succession speeches, before Ronan had learned to wear the Voss name like armor, Ilara spent most of her days inside that small restoration gallery where damaged things were handled carefully and silence was never used as a weapon. The place smelled of old wood, paper, varnish, and dust, warmed by lamps. Gilded frames leaned against walls, waiting for repair. Torn canvases rested beneath clean cloth. Nothing there performed importance. Everything had to earn its return slowly. That was why she loved it. To the outside world, Ilara Vale belonged to one of the richest private finance families in the country. But inside the Lark House, using her middle name and keeping the Vale surname off the door, she became almost invisible in the best possible way. She catalogued damaged pieces, cleaned fragile surfaces under supervision, handled donor records, and spent long hours listening instead of explaining herself. Neris Quill, the sharp-eyed curator, trusted her because Ilara never touched anything carelessly. Bram Hallow, an elderly donor who claimed he visited for art and stayed for conversation, trusted her because she remembered every story he told. Even Ivy, a little girl who came on weekends with her aunt, and ran straight to Ilara every time because children recognized safety faster than adults did. Then Ronan arrived. He came in carrying a Voss Foundation donation envelope and the restless look of a man finishing an obligation he had not chosen. His phone buzzed twice before he silenced it with visible irritation. He thanked Neris, glanced around politely, and was already halfway to the door when he heard Ilara speaking. She was kneeling beside Ivy in front of a darkened landscape, the child studying the painting with a frown. "Why does it look sad?" Ivy asked. Ilara smiled without looking up. "Because time leaves a film over everything." Ivy tilted her head. "Can you fix it?" "You don't fix a painting by attacking it," Ilara said gently. "You clean carefully. You pay attention to what it can survive. Sometimes age doesn't destroy the light. It only hides it." Ronan stopped. It was a small pause, barely visible, but it changed the direction of his visit. He stayed longer than he meant to, asked how restoration worked, Asked why old damage seemed to interest her more than polished things. Asked what a painting looked like before varnish yellowed over it. Ilara answered simply, without trying to impress him. That was part of what held him there. Around Ronan, most people either sold themselves or performed admiration. Ilara did neither. He came back the next week without a check. Then again. Sometimes he helped Bram carry books from the front desk to the reading room. Sometimes he stood beside Ilara while she logged incoming pieces and asked questions no one in his world probably expected him to ask. Sometimes he said almost nothing at all and only watched her work. And that watching should have warned her. Not because it was predatory, because it was sincere. And sincerity is always more dangerous when it breaks later. Ilara's hidden life had not been a whim. Years earlier, a kidnapping scare tied to the Vale name had ended whatever childish ideas she once had about wealth being glamorous. It had taught her family to close ranks. It had taught her father, Cassian Vale, to treat privacy as security rather than preference. And it had taught Ilara a lesson she never forgot. If people knew your name before they knew your character, too many of them would decide what they wanted from you before they decided whether they cared about you at all. So when Ronan kept coming back, she told him only what she believed was fair. That her family had money. That her life was more complicated than it looked. That privacy mattered to her for reasons she could not fully explain. That one day she might be pulled back into responsibilities she had spent years avoiding. He listened more carefully than most men did. One rainy evening, while Nerys locked the front entrance and the windows rattled softly in their frames, Ronan said, "I don't care what your name opens. I care who you are when the room is quiet." The line stayed with her because it did not sound rehearsed. A few weeks later, while helping her move a damaged frame into storage, he smiled and said, "You notice structures, not just surfaces." She looked at him more sharply then, because that was true. And because being accurately seen is the beginning of danger for anyone who has spent years hidden. Still, she let herself hope. They began taking long walks after closing. Bram teased them both without mercy. Ivy once asked whether Ronan worked at the gallery too, and he laughed harder than Ilara had heard him laugh before. For a while he seemed lighter there, less polished, less hungry, almost relieved by the version of himself that did not have to belong to his family every second. Then, one night beneath the skylight in the restoration wing, with the gallery closed and the air smelling faintly of rain and linseed oil, he asked her to marry him. No photographers, no family, no performance, just a ring in his hand and a look on his face she trusted. "There will never be a room where I let you stand alone," he promised. In the ballroom years later, with divorce papers waiting beneath her hand, that sentence came back so sharply it nearly stole her breath. Not because it had been a lie from the start, because once she had been almost certain he meant it, and that made what he became far worse. Near the edge of that memory, one smaller detail rose too, small then, obvious now. The first time Ronan had ever mentioned his family inside the gallery, his smile had faded before he answered. Even then, something in him had hesitated. Even then, some part of Ilara had noticed. The first time Ilara understood that Ronan's family saw love as a risk instrument, she was handed a pen before anyone offered her respect. The meeting took place in one of the Voss legal suites, a room of glass, steel, and perfect temperature, the kind designed to make paperwork feel more important than the people signing it. Every surface reflected posture, every chair discouraged comfort. By the time Ilara sat down, she already knew this conversation was not about prudence. It was about rank. Celeste smiled first, not kindly, carefully. "You understand this is standard," she said, folding her hands on the polished table. "Families like ours must be cautious." Families like ours. The insult sat inside the phrase so neatly that no one else needed to say it aloud. In their eyes, Ilara was not one of them. Not by name, not by history, not, in their thinking, by worth. Across the table, Gideon Voss did not even pretend at grace. "My son has a future," he said. "Sentiment is not governance." Then Orrin Pike, the family attorney, slid the prenup across the table. Ronan sat beside Ilara, close enough for his sleeve to brush hers, and said nothing. That silence landed harder than Gideon's contempt, because Ilara could have fought open arrogance, She could have dismissed Celeste's performance, but Ronan's silence forced her into a different kind of pain. The pain of watching the person who should have spoken for her decide the room mattered more. She lowered her eyes to the document. At first glance, the agreement looked like exactly what it claimed to be: expensive, protective, and ruthless. It limited marital claims. It separated assets. It locked down disclosures. It assumed imbalance from the first page. It treated her as if she had arrived at the marriage carrying appetite instead of choice. Celeste watched her read with the calm satisfaction of a woman expecting humiliation to do its work. But the deeper Elara read, the quieter she became. Because the prenup did not only protect the family, it revealed them. That realization came in layers. There were appendices tied to family trusts, disclosure schedules attached to contingent refinancing language, spousal confidentiality provisions that referred not only to personal wealth, but to lender certifications, governance events, and executive succession reviews. A spouse of a senior executive, she realized, might be required under certain credit conditions to receive or acknowledge material tied to restructuring and beneficial interest disclosure. That was not vanity drafting, that was fear hiding in legal language. She turned one page more slowly, then another. Ronan noticed the change in her face and leaned closer. "What is it?" "Nothing yet," she said. That answer was not evasion, it was precision. Because she was not certain what she had found, only that the Voss structure was less stable than its image suggested. One subsidiary carried more leverage than it should have. One family entity appeared tied to collateral in a way that was too aggressive for a healthy company. There were cross-references implying certain voting rights had been pledged as reassurance more than once. Quiet distress, dressed as sophistication. Across the table, Orrin Pike went very still. He had noticed that she noticed. That mattered. A soft knock interrupted the room. Alden Rook, the longtime CFO, entered with a supplemental packet. He looked like a man who had spent years cleaning up after other people's vanity. He placed the documents beside Gideon and glanced once at Elara. It was a brief look, but it lingered half a second too long. Another clue. Near the door stood Soren, there under the pretense of helping coordinate signatures and schedules. He said nothing, but his attention moved between faces with the alertness of someone who had survived powerful people by learning to spot what they missed. Celeste broke the silence. "I trust this won't take long." Elara finally looked up. Of course. Her calm unsettled them more than anger would have, because anger they could dismiss. Calm meant she was thinking. She returned to the document and finished every page, not because she enjoyed the insult, because if they intended to reduce her to paper, then paper deserved to be read properly. By the final page, she understood three things clearly. First, the family saw marriage as an exposure category. Second, the company was under more strain than anyone outside the innermost circle likely understood. Third, this document created a lawful path by which an executive spouse could later come into contact with confidential restructuring information if specific triggers were hit. They had tried to close a gate. Instead, they had built a door. Gideon slid the pen closer. "If your intentions are honorable, this should not trouble you." There it was, the test disguised as morality. Elara took the pen but did not sign immediately. Instead, she turned slightly toward Ronan. "What am I in this room?" she asked quietly. "A person, or a risk category?" His expression changed for only a second. Conflict, shame, recognition. But what came out of him was not defense. It was accommodation. "Ignore them," he said. "This is how they are around risk." He thought he was easing the moment. He only made it worse. Because he had accepted the frame without challenging it. Because he had allowed them to define her and then asked her to endure it gracefully. Somewhere deep in memory, Elara heard her father's voice from years earlier during a negotiation he had once let her observe. "When arrogant people underestimate you in writing, they are building your staircase." So she signed. Celeste relaxed immediately. Gideon leaned back like order had been restored. Ronan exhaled as though peace had been preserved rather than damaged. Only Alden Rook seemed to understand that something else had happened. As the meeting dissolved, he passed behind Elara's chair and said, too low for most of the room to hear, "This family confuses inheritance with competence." Soren heard it anyway. So did Ilara. The pages on the table looked like surrender. They were not surrender. They were evidence. And as Orrin Pike gathered the agreement, Ilara noticed one more detail, a notation in an appendix referring to spouse notification obligations in the event of executive restructuring or refinancing certification. She gave no outward reaction, but when she left that room, she understood something she had not understood when she entered. The Voss family's greatest weakness might not be arrogance alone. It might be how often they mistook silence for blindness. The marriage did not shatter in one moment. It thinned. Quietly. So quietly that for a long time, Ilara could still tell herself there was time to stop the damage. At home, Ronan could still resemble the man from the Lark House. He cooked badly and insisted that counted as charm. And he tucked notes into books he thought she would open on hard days. On nights when the world felt too loud, he sometimes sat beside her in silence and held her hand as if he still remembered that not every wound should be rushed into language. Those moments made everything worse, because they kept hope alive, because they turned betrayal from fate into choice. Outside those private spaces, the change came in increments small enough that each one might have been explained away by a weaker observer. A delayed answer, a colder tone, a glance at his father before speaking, an apology without correction. Ronan did not become cruel all at once. He became weaker first, and weakness, Ilara learned, often wore the face of caution before it hardened into betrayal. Celeste began with exclusions disguised as etiquette. Thus a donor dinner became politically delicate and somehow not the right setting for Ilara. A family gathering became overcrowded. A holiday table was laid one seat short, and nobody acknowledged it until the embarrassment was irreversible. Celeste preferred insults that could be denied later. That was her art. She did not strike openly when she could erase someone with manners. Gideon preferred direct contempt. He asked after Ilara's gallery work as if humoring a child's hobby. He called it pleasant in the tone men used when they believed only money built real value. Once, in front of 2 bored guests, he said, "It must be restful, spending your days around beautiful things other people paid for." Then he smiled. That smile mattered more than the line, and because it proved he wanted her to hear the insult and understand that he enjoyed her understanding it. Tamsin was colder still. She wrapped the same old hierarchy in the language of standards and sophistication. In front of guests, she praised Ilara's restraint. In private, she quietly assigned her the sort of social labor no true Voss daughter would ever be asked to do. Check the floral changes, call the caterer, smooth the seating issue, stay invisible, but useful. Maris was worse in a different way. Maris believed in almost nothing except proximity to power. She lived on company cards, guest lists, fashion loans, drivers, and the illusion that access was the same thing as substance. If Tamsin's cruelty came dressed as refinement, Maris's came dressed as laughter. Ilara noticed all of it. She noticed because she had been trained to. Cassian Vale had taught her that power revealed itself most clearly in small permissions. Who interrupted, who assumed obedience, who treated courtesy as optional when speaking to someone they considered weaker. Her mother, Serene, had taught her the second half of survival. Never answer humiliation with panic, because panic gives cruel people the proof they were hoping to see. So Ilara studied the Voss family the way she once studied damaged paintings, carefully, without announcing what she saw. Ronan's language changed before his actions did. "You don't understand how this world works. My family built things you can't imagine. Stop making everything personal." The sentences sounded practical, almost mature if someone heard only the surface. But Ilara heard the truth underneath them. "Stop making me choose. Stop forcing me to look at what they're doing. Stop reminding me of who I used to be when I loved you honestly." That was what he meant, and it hurt more because part of him clearly knew it. One evening at dinner, Gideon complained about a supplier failure in one of the company's divisions. Ilara listened, then said quietly that it did not sound like a supplier problem at all. It sounded like a culture problem. Fear, she said, was distorting information before it reached leadership. The wrong people were being rewarded for reassurance instead of accuracy. The table went still. Gideon stared at her as if a servant had interrupted a sermon. "You are mistaking observation for understanding," he said. Ronan said nothing. 2 weeks later, at a strategy reception she had not been meant to overhear closely, Alaylara watched Ronan repeat her exact analysis to a circle of executives. Same logic, same structure, same conclusion. The men around him nodded with impressed approval. Gideon looked pleased. Ronan did not mention her name. Ilara stood very still with a glass in her hand and learned that betrayal did not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrived as theft so quiet nobody else even recognized it as stealing. That night, Ronan came home flushed with praise, kissed her forehead, and asked whether she was tired. She almost laughed. Instead, she asked, "How did the meeting go?" "Better than expected," he said. He waited, perhaps for admiration, perhaps for absolution. She gave him neither. At a charity event not long after, Maris forgot to confirm enough event staff for setup. Boxes of printed place cards and decor samples somehow ended up in Ilara's hands, while guests drifted past in silk and soft music. She carried them without complaint until Soren stepped out from a service corridor, stopped short, and took the box from her immediately. "You should not let them train the room to treat you like this," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long second. Then she answered, "I'm still deciding what this room is worth." He held her gaze, and something unreadable crossed his face, surprise first, then unease. Because until that moment he had made the same mistake the others had. He thought she was enduring. He had not realized she was assessing. Across the room, Maris called for another missing item. Ronan glanced toward the sound, saw Soren holding the box instead of Ilara, and looked away too quickly. That glance lodged in Soren's mind, not because it was dramatic, because it looked like guilt. And guilt, Ilara had learned, was often the first visible crack before a structure failed. The company was beginning to fail, and Ilara saw it before the family admitted it. What frightened her more was that Ronan seemed to see it too, and kept choosing silence. Once she stopped looking at Voss Holdings the way guests looked at it, the warning signs were everywhere. Vendor payments running late, legal language growing more cautious, treasury calls turning urgent, reports that looked too smooth to be trustworthy, Gideon speaking more often about confidence than operations, Celeste hosting brighter dinners while staff moved through the house with the tight faces of people who knew more than they were allowed to say. From the outside, the family still looked untouchable. From the inside, the walls had started to shift. Ilara did what she always did when something felt wrong. She observed first. Then she tested the structure quietly. She listened when Ronan took late calls in the next room and ended them the moment she entered. She noticed when internal packets that used to remain open were suddenly left face down. She paid attention to which names were repeated too often and which names disappeared completely. She did not confront him immediately. She tried to help. One evening, when Ronan came home exhausted and careless enough to leave a lender memo half visible in his briefcase, she waited until he sat down before speaking. "The company doesn't only have a cash problem," she said, "it has a truth problem. Or people are filtering bad news before it reaches the people making decisions." Ronan loosened his tie without looking at her. "You're making assumptions from fragments." She held his gaze. Fragments are enough when the same fracture appears in every pane. For one brief moment, he looked at her the way he used to inside the Lark House, alert, respectful, almost relieved that someone else understood what he could not say aloud. Then the moment passed. He rubbed his forehead and said, "You don't understand how much pressure I'm under." Pressure again, always pressure, never truth. Still, she kept her voice calm. She suggested an independent operational review, a quiet governance intervention before lenders forced harsher terms, better internal reporting protections, contingency planning to protect employees if restructuring became unavoidable. Not because she wanted power, because she wanted the company stabilized before collapse, crushed thousands of people who had done nothing wrong. Ronan listened, half listened, then thanked her in the tone men used when accepting advice they did not intend to credit publicly. That would have hurt enough on its own. But life, around that same time, gave her one fragile reason to hope. She was pregnant. Ilara found out first, alone in the early morning. She looked at the test for so long, the light shifted across the bathroom floor. Her first feeling was not fear. It was stillness, then wonder, then a cautious happiness so tender she was afraid to move too quickly inside it. When she told Ronan that night, his whole face changed. For one precious moment, the distance between them fell away. He sat down slowly, took her hand in both of his, and looked at her as if the world had softened. "Are you sure?" he asked, almost smiling, almost stunned. She nodded. He kissed her forehead, then her knuckles, then rested his palm against her stomach with a care that nearly broke her. That night, he was the man from the gallery again. That was what made what followed unbearable. They told no one. Ilara wanted privacy. The Voss family had a talent for turning intimate things into leverage, symbols, and announcements. She wanted a little time first, a small sacred space that belonged only to them. Ronan agreed, but peace did not hold. Celeste's exclusions sharpened. Gideon's contempt became routine. Amaris drifted through company events on entitlement, while staff stretched themselves thin to uphold appearances. Tamsin kept assigning invisible labor with the precision of someone who knew how to humiliate without leaving proof. And Ronan began slipping again. Later nights, shorter answers, quicker temper, more hunger in him for his father's approval, as if professional assent could somehow outrun private emptiness. Ilara carried the strain quietly. Too quietly. The doctors never told her a single stressful week had caused the loss. They were too honest for that. But they did tell her that she had been exhausted, that her body had been under more pressure than it should have been, and that grief was not always dramatic before it arrived. The day she had planned to tell Ronan she was ready to share the pregnancy more openly, the world shifted instead. There was no public collapse, no cinematic scene, just a cold rush of fear she could not explain, a hospital corridor later, and then a room so silent it felt punitive. By the time Ronan arrived, pale and breathless, the future they had not yet spoken aloud to anyone else was gone. He stood beside her bed, looking shattered. For once, there was nothing polished in him. No executive tone, no family script, just a man too late to protect something that had already slipped out of both their hands. Ilara turned her face away, not because she blamed him for biology, because even then, in the middle of grief, she knew what would happen next. And she was right. Ronan stayed. He held her hand. He cried once, quietly. He said the right things for one night and part of the next morning. Then the calls began again. Our Gideon needed him. Timing mattered. Lenders were pressing. There was a dinner he could not miss. A board packet he had to review. A crisis that somehow always arrived wearing the costume of urgency and demanding obedience before morning. He went back to the family machine before the grief had even settled into language. That was the first crack Ilara knew would never fully close. Not because he had failed to prevent loss, because he allowed his family's rhythm to treat loss like inconvenience. After that, the company's decay and the marriage's decay became impossible for her to separate. Every interrupted meal, every unfinished conversation, every polished insult from Celeste, every casual dismissal from Gideon, every time Ronan looked tired, guilty, torn, and still chose them. Weeks later, Alden Rook sent a financial packet to the house for Ronan's review. Ilara saw it first. The redactions were wrong, not careless, intentional. When she asked Alden about it privately, he studied her for a long moment and said, "I wanted to see whether anyone left in this orbit still reads the truth." Then he told her something else. Several distant Voss relatives were under private financial pressure. Their holdings were not large enough to attract gossip, but some carried silent voting weight. If their personal liquidity tightened further, they might sell. A path, not an answer yet, but a path. Ilara went home that night still wanting, against reason, to save the company for the employees and save the marriage if anything honest still remained inside it. Because of the spouse notification language buried in the prenup's restructuring appendix, the promotion cycle materials had started passing through a review channel she was legally entitled to see. Then she opened one more internal packet tied to the pending promotion cycle and realized someone had already begun preparing a version of events in which, if recovery failed, she would be blamed for it. The page in Ilara's hand did not expose a misunderstanding. It exposed a plan. She had opened the packet expecting another sign of strain, more cautious lender language, another governance note, another legal clause carrying more fear than it admitted. Instead, she found internal talking points attached to the promotion cycle. The language was polished, discreet, and devastatingly clear. Ronan's elevation was not simply being prepared. It was being staged. The notes described a narrative for board members, lenders, and major investors. The refinancing had to look deliberate. The company's recent stabilization had to appear like disciplined leadership, not rescue. Gideon wanted one clean story powerful enough to steady every nervous stakeholder at once. Ronan Voss had matured into the architect of recovery. Ilara read that line twice. Architect of recovery. Her fingers tightened on the page, because she had spent months watching the company weaken under hidden strain, because she had quietly helped identify the real operational risks while Ronan drifted further into silence. Because now, in crisp executive language, she could see the family was not only trying to save the company, they were trying to author the memory of who had saved it. And she was not part of that memory. Worse than exclusion was the logic beneath it. Several supporting notes referred to the need for clean domestic optics around the succession announcement. One recommended separation from non-aligned personal influences before the formal transition. Another warned against domestic instability during a sensitive lender confidence window. One, written with enough caution to make it more disturbing, suggested that if recovery later faltered, spousal interference could provide a useful explanatory frame without directly blaming executive leadership. Ilara went still. They were building a shield. And that shield had her shape. For a long moment she did nothing but sit with the packet open in her lap, while the house around her stayed quiet. In the distance she could hear staff clearing dinner. On somewhere upstairs a door closed. The silence felt familiar now, not peaceful, evaluative. The kind that followed truth into a room and waited to see who would survive it. She thought of the hospital, of white sheets and unfinished grief, of Ronan holding her hand for one night and then answering calls from Gideon as if mourning could be rescheduled. She had spent weeks telling herself he was weak, not heartless. Pressured, not cruel. Torn, not gone. The page in her hand made that hope harder to defend. Because weakness had started becoming cooperation, because silence had started becoming strategy. She found Ronan in his study less than an hour later. He had one hand on the desk and the other on his phone when she entered. He looked up at once. He saw her face. Then he saw the page, and he knew. That was the first answer, not confusion, a recognition. Ilara crossed the room and laid the packet flat on the desk between them. She did not throw it. She did not raise her voice. That restraint made him more uneasy than anger would have. "What is this?" she asked. Ronan looked down, then away. "Where did you get that?" The question landed like an insult. She waited. When he did not answer, she said, "You don't need to explain where I found it. You need to explain why my removal is being written into your future." His face changed. First color left it, then certainty. He picked up the page and read only enough to confirm what he already feared. "You're reading this too harshly." She almost laughed, but the sound died before it formed. "Then read it gently for me," she said. "Tell me where I should hear love." The room went quiet. He set the page down too carefully. Could the way people handled things when they hoped controlled movement could replace honest language? He turned away once, then back. There was conflict in him, real conflict. That was the worst part. If he had become simple, obvious, easy to despise, letting go would have been easier. Instead, he said the sentence that killed the last of her illusions. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." Pressure, not loyalty, not truth. Not the child they had lost, not the wife standing in front of him, holding proof that his family had already started drafting her disappearance. Only pressure. Ilara stared at him and for a second saw the skylight at the Lark House instead of the study ceiling above them. Dust in warm light, his hand in hers, his promise that there would never be a room where he let her stand alone. Now he was helping build one. She did not cry. That surprised him. He had expected anger he could soften, or hurt he could redirect. What he saw instead was something calmer and far more dangerous. Clarity. "Your father is preparing to make me useful one last time," she said quietly, first as a wife who says nothing, then as a woman easy to blame. "That isn't fair." "No," she said, "it isn't." He opened his mouth again, but there was nothing left in him except explanation. And explanation no longer had value. Later that evening, in a side corridor outside Gideon's office, Soren stopped her. He had the restless look of a man who had seen too much to stay comfortable and too little to act cleanly. "I found transfer patterns that don't make sense," he said in a low voice. "Family shells, timing mismatches, and they're moving things before the refinancing closes." Ilara studied him. "If this company survives," she asked, "who deserves protection first?" Soren answered without hesitation. "The employees." That answer mattered, not because it solved anything, because it told her that at least one person inside the family orbit could still distinguish inheritance from responsibility. That night, Ilara sat alone with the packet, her notes, and the memory of Ronan choosing pressure over love for the last time. Until then, she had still been trying to save a marriage while quietly helping a company survive. After that night, she began thinking in layers. Debt first, voting blocks second, lender conditions third, governance triggers last. If the Voss family wanted to turn marriage into a transaction, and then structure would be the language that answered them best. And somewhere beneath the grief, something in Ilara settled into place with terrifying calm. Not revenge, decision. The night Ilara stopped asking whether Ronan would save their marriage, she began buying the future out from under his family. No one at Voss Holdings noticed at first. That was the point. While Gideon polished speeches, while Celeste hosted dinners to Project Calm, while Tamsin refined family messaging for lenders and social allies, and while Maris floated through rooms spending borrowed power as if it had been earned, Ilara moved in silence. Not recklessly, not emotionally, quietly, legally, piece by piece. Her work suite looked nothing like the Voss world. No crystal, no performance, no carefully staged elegance pretending everything was stable. Just screens, our legal pads, lender summaries, call logs, and a framed photograph of her father standing in a freight yard at dawn. Cassian Vale hated decorative power. He believed wealth only mattered if it could survive scrutiny. Ilara sat beneath that photograph night after night and built an answer. Not revenge, an answer. The first move came through debt. The Voss family still thought in terms of title, board seat, surname, and stagecraft. They believed control looked like a name at the top of a building. Ilara knew better. Control lived lower. In covenants, in cash flow, in who got paid first when confidence disappeared. Through purchasing entities far enough removed to avoid gossip but lawful enough to survive examination, she began buying distressed positions from lenders who had lost patience with Gideon's confidence. And some sold because they wanted distance, some because the company's risk no longer fit their portfolio, some because Ilara's terms were calm, fast, and credible. She did not overreach. That was what made her dangerous. Each acquisition was small enough to seem ordinary. Together they began changing the ground beneath the company. A few days later, a second path opened. A distant branch of the Voss family, kept close enough to be useful, far enough to stay underfunded, quietly needed liquidity. Their holdings were not glamorous, but they carried voting weight. Ilara's counsel, Ivan Dorr, presented the opportunity over a secure call with his usual restraint. "Useful, if timed properly," he said. Ilara studied the summary. "Will they know who is buying?" "No." "Good." She approved the purchase, not because she enjoyed taking from them, because they had mistaken bloodline for permanence, and permanent things should not wobble this easily. Still, the work was not purely financial. That mattered. She was not trying to burn the company down. She was trying to keep it alive long enough to remove the people poisoning it. That was why the next layer focused on protection. Payroll safeguards, pension shielding, severance reserves locked into the rescue package. Compliance review triggers inserted before regulators had reason to force them. A refinancing structure designed not only to stabilize the company, but to create lawful governance pressure if misconduct surfaced later. Maëlle Rowe, one of Vale's restructuring specialists, reviewed the model with her long after midnight. "You're building two companies at once," she said. "The one they think they control, and the one that will actually survive." Ilara did not answer immediately. On another screen, a lender dashboard flickered calmer than it had in weeks. The market was stabilizing. Not because Gideon had suddenly grown disciplined. Not because Ronan had become brilliant overnight. Because invisible work had begun doing what competence required. Finally, Ilara said, "I'm trying to keep innocent people from sinking with arrogant ones." That included Ronan, at least for a little while longer. That was the part she hated admitting, even to herself, because some last faithful corner of her still wanted him to step back from the ledge before the fall became public. She left one final door unlocked. She allowed the recovery to appear close enough to his reach that if there was any courage left in him, he could still choose truth before spectacle. Love did not die neatly, it bled out through delay. Alden Rook became useful without ever becoming sentimental. He never handed her anything improper. He simply stopped blocking the flow of truth. When lender moods shifted, he noticed. When certain internal obstacles disappeared at exactly the right time, he noticed that too. Once, over a short late call, he said only, "Someone has finally begun reading risk correctly." Ilara understood the message beneath it. He knew a stabilizing force had entered the structure. He was choosing not to ask its name. Soren noticed something too, though from farther away. He was not in the real decision rooms, but he understood patterns well enough to know the family's confidence no longer matched their recent fear. A week earlier, Gideon had been sharp, defensive, impossible. Now he was expansive again. And too expansive. The numbers had improved too quickly. The lenders had quieted too neatly. At a reception, Soren watched Gideon praise Ronan for steadying the company at exactly the right moment, and looked, for just a second, unconvinced. That look mattered, because it meant someone inside the family circle had started to sense intelligence where the family had shown none. Meanwhile, Maris was already spending against a future she had not built. Celeste revived old traditions as if stability proved superiority. Tamsin polished language around continuity, legacy, and disciplined succession. Gideon began repeating one phrase in private gatherings. The next era. Every celebration they planned was being built on Ilara's invisible architecture. Late one night, Maëlle asked the question more directly than anyone else had dared. "Do you want control," she said, "or correction?" The room went quiet. Outside the windows, dawn had not yet arrived. On the desk sat tea gone cold hours earlier. Ilara looked at her father's photograph, then at the deal structure on the screen, then finally at her own reflection in the dark glass. "I wanted correction," she said. Maëlle waited. Ilara's voice did not rise. "Control is what remains when correction is refused." By the end of that week, the refinancing closed. The lenders calmed. The stock rebounded just enough to look like confidence rather than rescue. And right on schedule, Gideon Voss announced a promotion party for Ronan, an elegant public celebration meant to prove the family had entered a new golden era. When Ilara saw the invitation, she understood the final shape of what was coming. Before the party began, she instructed outside counsel, the bank representative, and the emergency board chair to wait in a private conference suite off the ballroom until she gave the word. If they chose humility, Mercy might still live a little longer. If they chose humiliation, Mercy would end in that ballroom. And somewhere deep inside her, something quiet had already begun preparing for both outcomes. Ilara signed the last page, and the room breathed out as if it had just watched something necessary. That was their final mistake. Laughter moved table to table in soft, satisfied waves. Gideon looked relieved in the way men looked relieved when they believed humiliation had restored order. Celeste's mouth curved with quiet triumph. Maris leaned back with the smug ease of someone certain the evening had finally been cleaned of inconvenience. Even Ronan exhaled, as though cruelty had solved a problem he had been too weak to face honestly. Ilara folded the divorce papers once. Her fingers had stopped shaking. That, more than anything, should have warned them. Instead, they watched her with the easy cruelty people reserved for someone they believed had no power left. A few guests looked away now, embarrassed not by what had happened, but by how openly they had seen it. Others leaned closer, curious whether she would cry harder, plead, or leave. She did none of those things. She lifted her eyes and asked, calm as winter glass, "Would you like me to call counsel now, or wait until your next announcement?" For a moment the people nearest her did not understand. Then Maris laughed. "How efficient," she said. "She's scheduling her own exit." A few others joined in, ungrateful for permission. Ronan's expression tightened. "Ilara, don't turn this into—" She did not let him finish. She took out her phone, opened a message thread the room knew nothing about, and typed one word. "Proceed." She sent it. Nothing happened. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched long enough for the room to make another mistake. They thought the moment had failed. Celeste's smile widened. Gideon muttered something about dramatics. The quartet tried to resume, though the music had already gone thin with uncertainty. Then the ballroom doors opened. Not violently, precisely. The first people to enter were not security or police or chaos. They were worse. Outside counsel, a bank representative, the emergency board chair, 2 compliance officers, a senior restructuring advisor, or the kind of people whose presence together told every serious person in the room the same thing at once. This had not been improvised. The quartet stopped mid-phrase. Conversation died. Near the back, Alden Rook lowered his glass without surprise. That mattered. Soren saw it and went still. Orrin Pike, the family attorney, lost color so quickly it looked painful. The lead counsel crossed the ballroom without hesitation and stopped in front of Ilara. Not Gideon. Ilara. "Good evening, Ms. Vale." The words struck the room like broken glass. Not Mrs. Voss. Miss Vale. Ronan's face changed first, not confusion, recognition, then fear. Gideon stepped forward, voice sharp with disbelief. "There has been some misunderstanding." The emergency board chair did not even look at him when he answered. "No. The misunderstanding has lasted months." At the far end of the room, the giant screen behind the stage flickered. Ronan's smiling promotion slide vanished. The applause-colored background disappeared. In its place came ownership charts, emergency financing resolutions, covenant trigger notices, and board governance memoranda. Not every guest could read all of it. They did not need to. The shape of the truth was enough. People rose from tables without realizing they were standing. Someone whispered, "What is this?" Someone else answered, "Oh God." Then came the formal line, read aloud in a voice stripped of emotion. "Effective immediately, all succession declarations issued tonight are suspended pending ethics and governance review." Silence crashed through the ballroom. Ronan went pale. Celeste gripped the stem of her glass so hard, Ilara thought it might break. Tamsin's face lost its practiced calm. Maris blinked twice, the first sign that borrowed power had finally failed to protect her from reality. Ilara rose slowly. Tears still shimmered in her eyes, and now the room finally understood what it had failed to see before. Those tears had never belonged to defeat. They belonged to grief. The deep, private grief of a woman watching love collapse into strategy. She looked at Ronan first because she owed herself that honesty. "I never hid because I was ashamed," she said. Her voice was low, but the room had gone so silent it reached everyone. "I hid because I wanted one relationship in my life that did not begin with an audit." Then her gaze moved across Gideon, Celeste, the lawyers, the board representatives, and back to the man who had handed her divorce papers under chandeliers. "Tonight," she said, "you answered the question I spent years too afraid to ask." The bank representative stepped forward next and spoke with formal precision. The rescue structure that had stabilized Voss Holdings had been financed and assembled through Vale-backed entities. Controlling positions had shifted over months through lawful debt acquisition, refinancing leverage, and voting agreements activated during the restructuring. In practical terms, Vale-backed entities had bought the family company out from under the Vosses and now held controlling ownership of Voss Holdings. Gideon's discretionary authority was suspended. Ronan's promotion was frozen pending review. The public staging of a coercive divorce during a company event had created additional exposure under conduct and fiduciary review. The words kept landing. No one moved. Gideon found his voice first, though it came out thinner than before. "You should be grateful we let you stay as long as we did." Ilara turned to him. For the first time all night, Gideon looked less like a patriarch and more like a man who had mistaken a stage for ownership. "You should be careful with that word," she said. "You stayed inside a company I was already helping keep alive." That broke the room more completely than shouting would have. Someone near Gideon hissed, desperate and useless, "Sign and leave quietly." Ilara lifted the folded divorce papers. "I did," she said. "Now you may sit quietly while your board hears the truth." The line landed harder because she did not raise her voice. Then she said the sentence that reached backward through every insult, every dismissal, every time they had called her decorative, lucky, small and grateful. "Everything stable enough for you to celebrate tonight exists because someone you dismissed chose responsibility when you chose performance." No one laughed this time, no one even breathed loudly, because at last the room understood what the family had not. This was never a helpless wife being removed from a powerful family. This was a powerful woman allowing a family to complete its own humiliation before the structure changed hands in public, and judging by the faces around her, the documents on the screen were only the beginning. The collapse did not come with broken glass or screaming. It came with signatures, formal language, and the slow death of certainty. For a few seconds after Ilara's final line, no one in the ballroom seemed able to move. The screen still displayed ownership charts and governance notices. The quartet had gone silent. Glasses hovered midway to lips. Faces that had been glowing with triumph minutes earlier now looked stunned, pale, or carefully blank. Then Gideon exploded. "This is absurd," he snapped, stepping forward as if volume alone could restore power. "Who authorized this?" He did not look at Ilara when he said it. He looked at the board chair. Men like Gideon always assumed authority had to face them in a familiar shape. That was part of why he had failed to see the danger standing beside his own son for years. The board chair did not flinch. "It has not been your company in controlling terms for some time." That sentence landed harder than any insult. Gideon's face changed in stages, anger first, then disbelief, then something quieter and uglier, the first real outline of fear. He opened his mouth again, but this time the words came slower, as if he had finally understood that outrage was no longer a governing tool. Celeste tried next, reaching not for facts, but for status. "There must be some mistake," she said too quickly. "Our family has obligations, foundations, homes, partnerships." Counsel cut across her with professional calm. Several residences, discretionary accounts, and art-backed credit arrangements were now subject to review because they were tied to collateral structures under examination. Nothing had been seized recklessly. Nothing was theatrical, but nothing was safely beyond scrutiny either. The silence after that explanation was crueler than the words. Celeste did not look outraged now, she looked exposed. For the first time all evening, she resembled a woman learning that taste, posture, and old invitations were not the same as protection. Tamsin tried a different strategy. "This can still be managed," she said, though her voice had already lost polish. "We need to control the perception before this becomes a narrative issue." Narrative issue. Even now she reached for image before truth. Nearby, Maris was already fumbling for her phone, not to help anyone, to protect herself. She tapped once, frowned, tried again, then looked up too sharply. The company-backed account that had funded her orbit, travel, events, discretionary spending, and all the glossy things she had mistaken for identity, had already been suspended pending review. In less than 10 minutes, Gideon had lost authority. Ronan had lost his promotion, Celeste had lost the illusion of protected status. Maris had lost the accounts funding her life, and Tamsin had lost control of the narrative she trusted more than truth. That frightened her more than Gideon's collapse. Because Maris had built no power of her own. She had only rented it. Across the room, Orrin Pike understood the legal danger faster than the family did. His face had gone carefully neutral, which was worse than panic. He had heard every line spoken during the divorce ambush. He knew exactly what had been said about usefulness, removal, and gratitude. He knew those words were now tied to a corporate event, a board proceeding, and a discoverable witness pool. He did not defend the family, he began silently measuring distance from them. And through all of it, Ronan looked only at Ilara. Not at the screen, not at the board chair, not at his father coming apart in slow motion. At her. "You did this?" he asked. But that was not what he meant. What he meant was, you were the reason any of this still stood. Ilara met his gaze without triumph. That mattered. This was not the moment for cruelty. Cruelty would have made her smaller than she was. "I prevented collapse," she said. "I secured payroll. I protected pensions. I locked in severance reserves if restructuring becomes necessary. I made sure employees would not pay for executive vanity. What happens tonight is not destruction. It is accountability." Her voice did not rise, or yet the room listened harder than it had listened to Gideon all evening. Then she turned, not toward the family first, but toward the wider room, the executives, assistants, managers, analysts, legal staff, and quiet observers who had arrived expecting a promotion toast and instead witnessed the structure beneath the celebration split open. "I did not step in to punish a family," she said. "I stepped in because thousands of employees did not deserve to drown under inherited arrogance. Institutions this large should not remain in the hands of people who treat dependence, marriage, and gratitude as tools. I believed for too long that this family might become better. Tonight you made your answer clear. That changed the air, not because it softened the blow, because it gave the room a moral center." The HR chief, pale and visibly shaken, had stepped forward when prompted and read the employee protections aloud. Salaries were secure. Benefits remained protected. Pension obligations had been ring-fenced. Ethical employees would be retained through transition review. Immediate scrutiny applied to leadership, not to the ordinary people who had kept the company functioning. Fear was still there. But beneath it, something else began to move. Relief. And then respect. A stunned, unwilling respect from people who had expected a rich woman's reveal and instead found a disciplined operator protecting the innocent while removing the guilty. Soren stepped forward before Gideon could reclaim the room with noise. His face was tight, but his voice was steady. "She saved the company you were celebrating," he said, looking directly at Gideon. "You turned the rescue into a stage for humiliation." "Be quiet," Gideon snapped. Soren did not move. That mattered too, because his defiance was not dramatic. It was chosen. And choice, Ilara thought, had always been the real theme of the night. Ronan took one step toward her then, not as an executive, not as a son, as a man who had finally begun to understand the full cost of his own weakness. His face held something worse than panic now. Recognition. Because the deepest punishment waiting for him was no longer the public freeze of his promotion or the loss of his father's certainty. It was the unbearable knowledge that the woman he had discarded had been the quiet structure beneath his entire world, and that he had helped destroy the only thing in his life that had ever tried to save him without asking for applause. Ronan came after her before the ballroom had finished collapsing behind them. That was the first honest thing he had done all night. The corridor outside was lined with tall mirrors and soft gold lights that made everyone look calmer than they felt. Behind the closed doors, voices still rose and broke in waves. Lawyers speaking low, Gideon raging, Celeste demanding answers, staff moving carefully as if one wrong step might shatter the last illusion of the evening. But in the corridor the silence felt different. Sharper, private, dangerous. Ilara stopped walking but did not turn immediately. She still held the signed divorce papers in one hand. Not tightly, not like a wound, like a tool that had finally changed purpose. Ronan's footsteps slowed behind her. When she turned, he looked undone in a way she had not looked at closely in years. In his face carried too many men at once, the one from the Lark House, the one from the hospital, the one who had stood under chandeliers and asked for her public humiliation as if it were maturity. For one painful second she saw all of them. That almost made the ending harder. "I was trapped," he said first. Not hello, not I'm sorry, trapped. His voice was low and raw in a way that might once have moved her. Now it only made her tired. He took one step closer, then stopped, as if even he understood he had forfeited the right to close distance carelessly. "You know what my father is like," he said. "You know what he does to people. I thought if I handled it quietly, if I just—" "Quietly." He said it standing in the aftermath of a public divorce ambush. Ilara looked at him without blinking. That silence forced him onward. "I still love you," he said. There it was, too late, too small, too broken by everything around it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The mirrors threw their reflections back at them from different angles, making it look as though there were a dozen versions of this ending and all of them had failed. Then Ilara answered. "No," she said softly, "you loved me when loving me cost you nothing. Then you loved your family's approval more." He flinched as if she had struck him. "That isn't true." "It is exactly true." He tried again, more desperate now. "I was trying to protect what I could." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you know when I stopped believing that?" He said nothing. She spared him nothing either. The hospital. His face changed, not because he had forgotten, because he had hoped she might one day forgive the meaning of it. "You lost our child too," he said, almost pleading. "Yes," she said, "and I watched you grieve for one night before you let your father schedule the rest of your mourning." The line landed between them with brutal stillness. She did not say he caused the loss. She did not need melodrama to wound him. Truth was enough. "I never blamed you for biology," she said. "I blamed you for what came after, for showing me that even then, your family's demands would outrank our life." He went pale. Ilara's voice stayed calm. "I had still been trying after that, Ronan. That is the part you never understood. I was still trying. I was still helping. I was still hoping you would choose truth once, just once, without being forced. Tonight was your last chance." "That was the tragedy," he said hoarsely. "I know," she answered, "but love that collapses under pressure is not strong enough to build a life on." He stared at her like a man looking for a door that had already disappeared. "Tell me there's still something to fix." She looked down at the divorce papers in her hand. In the ballroom, those papers had been staged as a weapon, a threat, a public removal. Here, in the quiet of the corridor, they had become something else. "These became useful," she said, "the moment they stopped being a weapon." Then she gave him the truth he had earned. "Love that requires my humiliation to survive was never love." That ended it. He did not argue after that. Perhaps because he could not. And perhaps because some final part of him understood that pleading now would only deepen the shame. He stepped back once, then again, and for the first time in the entire marriage, Ilara saw what it looked like when Ronan Voss had no one left to hide behind. Later, Soren found her near the service exit, while lawyers and executives moved through the final stages of the night. He looked exhausted, stripped of his usual caution. "I should have said something sooner," he admitted. "Not tonight, before tonight." That apology mattered because it did not ask to be forgiven too quickly. Ilara studied him, then nodded once. "Stay," she said, "but if you do, you stay by merit." "I understand." And he did. Months later, the company no longer resembled a family throne. Nepotism had been cut back. Governance had been tightened. Ethical employees stayed. Alden Rook retired with quiet honor after helping stabilize the transition. The staff who had feared collapse kept their pay, their benefits, and their dignity. The ones who had built nothing and fed on power lost their place. Ilara returned to the Lark House openly. She restored damaged rooms, expanded the foundation, and built a program for women pushed into silence by powerful families and elegant cruelty. She chose visibility on her own terms, not because she wanted attention, but because she no longer confused hiding with safety. And before dawn one morning, Ronan stood outside the gallery windows, looking in at the life he had once touched and failed to protect. Inside, Ilara walked through restored light without hesitation. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was building something that could not be shamed into silence again. And somewhere in the quiet strength of that new life, the future finally belonged to the person who had earned it. Ilara stood in the quiet light of the Lark House, no longer hidden, no longer grieving the life Ronan had failed to protect. The woman they humiliated at the promotion party had not been destroyed. She had simply seen the truth before they did. The Voss family did not lose everything because Ilara wanted revenge. They lost because arrogance made them blind. They mistook silence for weakness, dignity for helplessness, and kindness for something they could humiliate without consequence. But Ilara's greatest victory was never the company. It was walking away with her name, her strength, and her future fully her own. And in the end, that hurt them more than any public downfall ever could.